Stockton Rush. I'm the CEO and founder of OceanGate. Taking a completely new approach to the sub design, and it's all run with this game controller and these touch screens.
This morning, an ROV, or remote operated vehicle, from the vessel Horizon Arctic discovered the tailcone of the Titan submersible.
The primary task of a submersible is to not implode. At dawn 4 summers ago, the French submariner and Titanic expert Paul-Henri Nargeolet stood on the bow of an expedition vessel in the North Atlantic. The air was cool and thick with fog, the sea placid, the engine switched off, and the Titanic was some 3,800 meters below. The crew had gathered for a solemn ceremony to pay tribute to the more than 1,500 people who had died in the most famous maritime disaster more than 100 years ago. Rob McCallum, the expedition leader, gave a short speech, then handed a wreath to Nargeolet, the oldest man on the ship. As is tradition, the youngest McCallum's nephew was summoned to place his hand on the wreath, and he and Nargeolet let it fall into the sea. After the wreath sank from view, the submersible hatch and the dive began. For some members of the crew, the sight of the wreck was familiar, but for Paul-Henri Nargeolet, whose life was most entwined with the Titanic, he had dived it more than 30 times beginning shortly after its discovery in 1985 and now served as the underwater research director for the organization that owns salvaging rights to the wreck. Nargeolet remained obsessed with the Titanic, so Nargeolet climbed into a radically different submersible owned by a company called OceanGate, which had spent years marketing to the general public that for a fee of $250,000, it would bring people to the most famous shipwreck on Earth.
People are so enthralled with Titanic that there are 3 words in the English language that are known throughout the planet, and that's Coca-Cola, God, and Titanic.
Nargeolet served as a guide to the wreck, Rush as the pilot. The other 3 occupants were tourists. They had many dives together, but the last one they did that we all know about, before they reached the bottom, the submersible vanished, triggering an international search and rescue operation, with an accompanying media frenzy centered on counting down the hours until oxygen would run out, then the implosion, which we have talked earlier in the past video. But how all of that started, how a successful submarine company turned into a disaster, and what led to all of these circumstances. Let's begin.
100,000 people jam Independence Square in Philadelphia to hear President Kennedy declare that the United States looks forward to a Declaration of Interdependence.
Stockton Rush was born into a wealthy family in San Francisco, named for 2 of his ancestors who signed the Declaration of Independence, Richard Stockton and Benjamin Rush. His maternal grandfather was an oil and shipping tycoon. As a teenager, Rush became an accomplished commercial jet pilot, and he studied aerospace engineering at Princeton, where he graduated in 1984. Rush wanted to become a fighter pilot, but his eyesight wasn't perfect, and so he went to business school instead. Years later, he expressed a desire to travel to space, and he reportedly dreamed of becoming the first human to set foot on Mars. In 2004, Rush traveled to the Mojave Desert, where he watched the launch of the first privately funded aircraft to brush against the edge of space. The only occupant was the test pilot. Richard Branson stood on the wing and announced that a new era of space tourism had arrived. At that point, Rush abruptly lost interest, saying, "I didn't want to go up into space as a tourist," he said.
I wanted to be Captain Kirk on the Enterprise. I wanted to explore.
Rush had grown up scuba diving in Tahiti, the Cayman Islands, and the Red Sea. In his mid-40s, he tinkered with a kit for a single-person mini-submersible and piloted it around at shallow depths near Seattle, where he lived. Rush began looking into purchasing a submersible, but discovered there were fewer than 100 privately owned submarines worldwide and was unable to purchase one. He instead constructed a miniature submersible using blueprints provided to him by a retired US Navy submarine commander. Around 2007, Rush began to explore the idea of founding his own submarine company. A few years later, in 2009, he co-founded OceanGate with business partner Guillermo Sonline, with a dream to bring tourists to the ocean world.
I'd come across this business anomaly I couldn't explain. If 3/4 of the planet is water, how come you can't access it?
Since 2009, till 2014, OceanGate transported paying customers in leased commercial submersibles off the coast of California, in the Gulf of Mexico, and in the Atlantic Ocean. But that wasn't what Rush wanted at all. Rush wanted media attention. So he realized that visiting shipwreck sites was a way to get into that. In 2015, OceanGate announced that it had built its first submersible in collaboration with the University of Washington's Applied Physics Laboratory. In fact, it was mostly a cosmetic and electrical refit for a Portuguese marine research non-profit almost 2 decades before. It had a pressure hull that was the shape of a capsule pill and made of steel, with a large acrylic viewport on one end. It was designed to go no deeper than 500 meters, a comfortable cruising depth for military submarines. OceanGate called it Cyclops 1. Most submersibles have duplicate control systems, running on separate batteries that way. If one system fails, the other still works. But during the refit, engineers at the University of Washington rigged the Cyclops 1 to run from a single PlayStation 3 controller.
Combination steering wheel and gas pedal, which is this device. This is a Sony PlayStation PS3 gaming controller. And with this device, we can drive the submarine, make it go up, down, left, right, forward, and backwards.
Around that time, Rush set his sights on the Titanic. Cyclops 1 would only travel to depths of 1,640 feet, and the Titanic is 12,500 feet away. Rush wanted more. OceanGate would have to design a new submersible, but Rush decided to keep most of the design elements of Cyclops 1. Suddenly, the University of Washington was no longer involved in the project, although OceanGate's contract with the Applied Physics Laboratory was less than 1/5 complete. Thought of Rush's plan to essentially reconstruct a craft that was designed for 500 meters of pressure to withstand 8 times that much. As the company planned Cyclops 2, Rush reached out to McCallum for help.
He wanted me to run his Titanic operation for him.
At that time, McCallum was the only person he knew who had run commercial expedition trips to Titanic. Stockton's plan was to go a step further and build a vehicle specifically for this multi-passenger expedition. McCallum gave him some advice on marketing and logistics and eventually visited the workshop outside Seattle, where he examined the Cyclops 1. He was disturbed by what he saw.
Everyone was drinking Kool-Aid and saying how cool they were with a Sony PlayStation. So I told him, does Sony know that it's been used for this application? Because, this is not what it was designed for. And now you have the hand controller talking to a Wi-Fi unit, which is talking to a black box, which is talking to the sub's thrusters. There were multiple points of failure. Every sub in the world has hardwired controls for a reason, that if the signal drops out,
One day, McCallum climbed into the Cyclops for a test dive at a marina. There, he met the chief pilot, David Lockridge, a Scotsman who had spent 3 decades as a submersible pilot and an engineer, first in the Royal Navy, then as a private contractor. Lockridge had worked all over the world, on offshore wind farms in the North Sea, on subsea cables installations in the Atlantic, Indian and Pacific Oceans, on manned submarine trials with the Swedish Navy, on submarine rescue operations for the navies of Britain and Singapore. He had been hired by OceanGate in May 2015 as its Director of Marine Operations and Chief Submersible Pilot. The company moved him and his family to Washington and helped him apply for a green card. But during the harbor trial, the Cyclops got stuck in shallow water. He said with his interview with the New Yorker, "It was hilarious because there were 4 very experienced operators in the sub, stuck at 20 or 25 feet, and we had to sit there for a few hours while they worked it out," McCallum recalled. He liked and trusted Lockridge, but of the sub, he said, "This thing is a mutt." Rush eventually decided that he would not attempt to have the Titanic-bound vehicle classed by a marine certification agency such as DNV. He had no interest in welcoming into the project an external evaluator who would, as he saw it, need to first be educated before being qualified to validate any innovations. That marked the end of McCallum's desire to be associated with the project.
The minute that I found out that he was not going to class the vehicle, that's when I said, "I'm sorry, I just can't be involved." Stockton didn't like that.
As word got out that Rush planned to take tourists to the Titanic, McCallum recalled, "People would ring me and say, 'We've always wanted to go to Titanic. What do you think?' And I would tell them, 'Never get in an unclassed sub. I wouldn't do it, and you shouldn't either.'" In the early 2018, McCallum heard that Lockridge had left OceanGate. Lockridge emailed McCallum that things are very bad in the company and he's getting inaccurate reports. The submersible industry is small, and a single disaster could destroy it. But the only way forward without a catastrophic operational failure was for OceanGate to redesign the submersible in coordination with a classification society. Long story short, Lockridge was afraid of retaliation from Rush because this man has had influence and money that can keep anybody's mouth shut, but the only thing he could share with McCallum that this sub isn't safe to dive. Rush wanted to fit as much passengers as possible to the new sub, but he faced a problem that the size dictated the choice of materials, and the steel hull will make his sub too small for that. So he decided he will change the entire materials and add a cylindrical midsection made of carbon fiber so he can have enough room for people.
So we have a carbon fiber hull, it's 5 inches thick, and titanium domes on the end. If you're operating within a known environment, as most submersible manufacturers do, they don't break things.
Toward the end of that year, Lockridge became increasingly concerned. OceanGate would soon begin manned sea trials for Cyclops Second in the Bahamas, and he believed that there was a chance that they would result in catastrophe. The consequences for Lockridge could extend beyond OceanGate's business and the trauma of losing colleagues. As Director of Marine Operations, Lockridge had a contract specifying that he was ultimately responsible for ensuring the safety of all crew and clients. On January 18, 2018, Lockridge studied each major component and found several critical aspects to be defective or unproven. He drafted a detailed report, which has not previously been made public, and attached photographs of the elements of greatest concern. Glue was coming away from the seams of ballast bags, and mounting bolts threatened to rupture them. Both sealing faces had errant plunge holes and O-ring grooves that deviated from standard design parameters. The exostructure and electrical pods used different metals, which could result in galvanic corrosion when exposed to seawater. The thruster cables posed snagging hazards. The Iridium satellite beacon, to transmit the submersible's position after surfacing, was attached with zip ties. The flooring was highly flammable. The interior vinyl wrapping emitted highly toxic gases upon ignition. To assess the carbon fiber hull, Lockridge examined a small cross-section of material. He found that it had very visible signs of delamination and porosity. It seemed possible that, after repeated dives, it would come apart. He shone a light at the sample from behind and photographed beams streaming through splits in the midsection in a disturbing, irregular pattern. The only safe way to dive, Lockridge concluded, was to first carry out a full scan of the hull. The next day, Lockridge sent his report to Rush, Nissen, and other members of the OceanGate leadership. Lockridge said in an interview that Rush was furious. He called a meeting that afternoon and recorded it on his phone. For the next 2 hours, the OceanGate leadership insisted that no hull testing was necessary. An acoustic monitoring system to detect fraying fibers would serve in its place. According to the company, the system would alert the pilot to the possibility of catastrophic failure, with enough time to arrest the descent and safely return to surface. But in a court filing, which we are going to talk about later, Lockridge's lawyer wrote, this type of acoustic analysis would only show when a component is about to fail, often milliseconds before an implosion, and would not detect any existing flaws prior to putting pressure onto the hull. A former senior employee who was present at the meeting told me, "We didn't even have a baseline. We didn't know what it would sound like if something went wrong." Now, after the 2 hours passed, the meeting ended in Lockridge's firing. Soon afterward, Rush asked OceanGate's Director of Finance and Administration whether she'd like to take over as Chief Submersible Pilot. It freaked out that he would want me to be head pilot since her background is in accounting. She said that several of the engineers were in their late teens and early 20s and were at one point being paid $15 an hour. Without Lockridge around, I could not work for Stockton. I did not trust him. As soon as she was able to line up a new job, she quit. Lockridge knew that this incident will happen. He said, "I don't want to be seen as a tattletale, but I'm so worried he kills himself and others in the quest to boost his ego." OceanGate claimed that Cyclops II had the first pressure vessel of its kind in the world. But there's a reason why other manufacturers don't use carbon fiber in their hulls.
Carbon fiber is 3 times better on a strength to buoyancy basis than titanium. And underwater, that's what you care about. It's not strength to weight, it's strength to buoyancy. And yet no one had done that. And there are certifying or semi-certifying agencies, the Pressure Vessels for Human Occupation Committee that handle...
McCallum tried to reason with Rush directly. You are wanting to use a prototype unclassed technology in a very hostile place. As much as I appreciate entrepreneurship and innovation, you are potentially putting an entire industry at risk. Rush replied that he had grown tired of industry players who tried to use a safety argument to stop innovation and new entrants from entering their small existing market. We have heard the baseless cries of, "You are going to kill someone," way too often. I take this as a serious personal insult. On the other hand, Lockridge tried to take things to the court, contacted the United States Department of Labor, alleging to its Occupational Safety and Health Administration that he had been terminated in retaliation for raising safety concerns. He also sent the OSHA investigator Paul McDevitt a copy of his Cyclops II inspection report, hoping that the government might take actions that would prevent the potential for harm to life. A few weeks later, McDevitt contacted OceanGate, noting that he was looking into Lockridge's firing as a whistleblower protection matter. OceanGate's lawyer, Thomas Gilman, soon issued Lockridge a court summons. He had 10 days to withdraw his OSHA claim and pay OceanGate almost $10,000 in legal expenses. Otherwise, Gilman wrote, OceanGate would sue him, take measures to destroy his professional reputation, and accuse him of immigration fraud. Gilman also reported to OSHA that Lockridge had orchestrated his own firing because he wanted to leave his job and maintain his ability to collect unemployment benefits. McDevitt of OSHA notified the Coast Guard of Lockridge's complaint. There is no evidence that the Coast Guard ever followed up. Lockridge received the summons while he was at his father's funeral. He and his wife hired a lawyer, but it quickly became clear that he didn't have the money to fight this guy. A few weeks after Lockridge was fired, OceanGate announced that it was testing its new submersible in the marina of Everett, Washington, and would soon begin shallow water trials in Puget Sound. To preempt any concerns about the carbon fiber hull, the company touted the acoustic monitoring system, which was later patented in Rush's name. Safety is our #1 priority, Rush said in an OceanGate press release. We believe real-time health monitoring should be standard safety equipment on all manned submersibles. In other words, Rush was trying with this words, making it sound like the Cyclops is more advanced because it has this system when the opposite is true. The submersible is so experimental, and the factor of safety completely unknown, that it requires a system to warn the pilot of impending collapse. Other people in the industry trying to stop Stockton Rush from doing it. A company named Triton Submarines, they considered the risk to life to be so evident that the government should get involved. They drafted a letter to McDevitt, the OSHA investigator, urging the Department of Labor to take immediate and decisive action to stop OceanGate from taking passengers to the Titanic before people die. But they were afraid that the Department of Labor might perceive the letter as an attack on a business rival. By now, OceanGate had renamed Cyclops to Titan, apparently to honor the Titanic. That pissed the people in Triton because that was very close to their sub-name, Stockton Plan. Didn't end here. He strategically structured everything to be out of US jurisdiction. In a legal filing, the company reported that the submersible was being developed and assembled in Washington but will be owned by a Bahamian entity, will be registered in the Bahamas, and will operate exclusively outside the territorial waters of the United States. Although it is illegal to transport passengers in an unclassed experimental submersible, because under US regulations, you do get in a little bit of trouble in the eyes of the law, but if you kill a passenger, you're in big trouble. And so everyone was classified as a mission specialist. There were no passengers. The word passenger was never used. No one bought tickets. They contributed an amount of money set by Rush to one of OceanGate's entities to fund their own missions. In my opinion, this man is really brilliant. In an evil way, of course. He made a strategic plan to not just avoid liability in Washington state, but avoid liability with an offshore corporate structure and keeping the US Coast Guard from breathing down his neck. And after all of that planned, it's time for execution. We were all told, intimately informed, that this was a dangerous mission that could result in death, an OceanGate mission specialist told Fox News last week. Carbon fiber makes noise, Rush told David Pogue, a CBS News correspondent last summer during one of the Titanic expeditions. It crackles. The first time you pressurize it, if you think about it, of those million fibers, a couple of them are sort of weak. They shouldn't have made the team. He spoke of signs of hull breakage as if it were perfectly routine. The first time we took it to full pressure, it made a bunch of noise. The second time, it made very little noise. Fibers do not regenerate between dives. Nevertheless, Rush seemed unconcerned. It's a huge amount of pressure from the point where we'd say, oh, the hull's not happy, to when it implodes, he noted. You just have to stop your descent. It's not clear that Rush could always stop his descent. Once, as he piloted passengers to the wreck, a malfunction prevented Rush from dropping weights. Passengers calmly discussed sleeping on the bottom of the ocean, 3,800 meters down. After 24 hours, a drop weight mechanism would dissolve in the seawater, allowing the submersible to surface. Eventually, Rush managed to release the weights manually, using a hydraulic pump. Last year, a BBC documentary crew joined the expedition. Rush stayed on the surface vessel while Scott Griffith, OceanGate's Director of Logistics and Quality Assurance, piloted a scientist and 3 other passengers down. During the launch, a diver in the water noticed and reported to the surface vessel that something with a thruster seemed off. Nevertheless, the mission continued. More than 2 hours passed. After Titan touched down in the silt, Griffith fired the thrusters and realized something was wrong. I don't know what's going on, he said. As he fiddled with the PlayStation controller, a passenger looked out the viewport. "Am I spinning?" Griffith asked. "Yes, I am. Looks like it," another passenger said. "Oh my God," Griffith muttered. One of the thrusters had been installed in the wrong direction. "The only thing I can do is a 360, he said. They were in the debris field, 300 meters from the intact part of the wreck. One of the clients said that she had delayed buying a car, getting married and having kids, all because I wanted to go to Titanic, but they couldn't make their way over to its bow." Griffith relayed the situation to the ship. Rush's solution was to remap the PS3 controller. Rush couldn't remember where the buttons were, and it seems as though there was no spare controller on the ship. Someone loaded an image of a PlayStation 3 controller from the internet, and Rush worked out a new button routine. "Yeah, left and right might be forward and back. Huh? I don't know," he said. "It might work." "Right is forward," Griffith read off his screen, 2.5 miles below. I'm going to have to write this down." "Right is forward," Rush said. "Great, live with it." Shipwrecks are notoriously difficult and dangerous to dive. Rusted cables drape the Titanic, moving with the currents. A broken crow's nest dangles over the deck. Griffith piloted the submersible over to the wreck and passengers within feet of it, while teaching himself in real time to operate a Bluetooth controller whose buttons suddenly had different functions than those for which he had trained. According to David Lockridge's court filings, from 2018, Cyclops II's viewport had a depth rating of only 1,300 meters, approximately 1/3 of Titanic's depth. It is possible that this had changed by the time passengers finally dived. But, Lockridge's lawyer wrote, OceanGate refused to pay for the manufacturer to build a viewport that would meet the required depth. In May, Rush invited Victor Vescovo, a deep-sea explorer with world records, and Hamish Harding to join his Titanic expedition. But Vescovo refused to show in such a risky mission, while his friend, the British billionaire Hamish Harding, whom Vescovo had previously taken in the limiting factor to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, signed up to be a mission specialist. On the morning of June 18th, Rush climbed inside the Titan, along with Harding, the British-Pakistani businessman Shahzada Dawood, and his 19-year-old son Sulman, who had reportedly told a relative that he was terrified of diving in a submersible but would do so anyway, because it was Father's Day. He carried with him a Rubik's Cube so that he could solve it in front of the Titanic wreck. The fifth diver was P.H. Narjolet, the Titanic expert, Vescovo's former safety advisor, Leahy and McCallum's old shipmate and friend. He had been working with OceanGate for at least a year as a wreck navigator, historian and guide. The force of the implosion would have been so violent that everyone on board would have died before the water touched their bodies. For the Five Deep's crew, Narjolet's legacy is complicated by the circumstances of his final dives.
I'd like to be remembered as an innovator. I think it was General MacArthur said, "You're remembered for the rules you break." And, I've broken some rules to make this. I think I've broken them with logic and good engineering behind me. The carbon fiber and titanium, there's a rule you don't do that. Well, I did.